The sound of wedding bells echoes through cathedral, rolling across Madrid like a command from heaven itself. But if you listen closely that day, you might have caught another sound. Something quieter, almost lost beneath the clamor. The muffled sobs of a girl, scarcely 14, whose fate has been decided without her consent. Picture Madrid in the year 1560. The city, swelling with pride as a capital of a global empire, rises in stone and shadow. Carriages rumble through narrow streets. Nobles in embroidered silks and velvets jostle for space in cathedral, their jewels catching the light of incense flames that rise like prayers toward the vaulted ceilings. And at the altar waiting stands King Philip II of Spain, 32 years old, pale, severe, a man whose very presence carries the gravity of empire. His bride, Isabelle de Valois, is almost still a child, draped in cloth of gold so heavy it threatens to bow her frail frame. She walks forward like a figure carved into some solemn ritual. The people see grandeur. They see peace sealed between France and Spain. What they do not see is the breaking of a human spirit. For this is not a love story, not even a triumph of politics. It is a systematic destruction of a girl who was once simply a daughter, a sister, a child, and is now remade into a living treaty. To understand how such a fate can unfold, we must step back. The year is 1559. Europe is exhausted. France and Spain have bled each other dry in a conflict that spanned generations. The Italian wars, decades of shifting battle lines, castles razed, treasuries emptied, and entire countrysides laid waste. Kings chased glory on Italian soil, while common folk starved. French gold flowed endlessly into campaigns that returned little more than corpses. Spanish silver, hauled across oceans in the New World, vanished into the same furnace of endless war. At last, both realms reached the brink. Pride, however, often outlasts pragmatism in royal veins. To end the slaughter, the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis was signed. But treaties require sacrifices, and the coin of diplomacy was not land nor gold, nor blood already spilled. The true price would be flesh. Innocent flesh, wrapped in silks and paraded as though she were treasure. In the French court, the child who would be that sacrifice lived in almost sacred innocence. Isabelle de Valois, daughter of King Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici, was raised in the splendor of the Louvre. Her childhood unfolded in chambers hung with tapestries of unicorns and myth, under ceilings painted with heavens. She laughed at her ladies-in-waiting over embroidery, chased her younger siblings through garden mazes, and played music in rooms where art and poetry flourished. By 13, she spoke fluent Latin, could play the lute with skill enough to impress seasoned musicians, and embroider with mastery that astonished her tutors. Her chaplain praised her piety, her dancing master her grace, her instructors her intellect. To those around her, she seemed a model of perfection. And yet in the cruel arithmetic of dynastic politics, perfection meant only one thing: vulnerability. The men who drafted peace at Cateau-Cambrésis never paused to imagine her life. To them, she was a signature, a dowry, a pawn. The treaty demanded that the French king's daughter be given to Spain's Philip II, and Isabelle, barely into her adolescence, was chosen. When the news reached her, she could not understand it at first. Marriage was a word with no meaning to her, a cloud of smoke drifting through her mind. She still slept with her favorite doll tucked against her side at night. She still believed, as children do, that adults existed to protect rather than to trade. Her father tried to explain. Peace, alliance, sacred duty, the good of France. He spoke of thousands of French lives saved by this union, of prosperity secured, of honor preserved. But beneath the words was a harsher truth. He was selling his daughter's childhood to buy a pause in a war destined to flare again. Isabelle asked, in a small voice that trembled in the vastness of the throne room, "Why me?" And though her father cloaked the answer in noble phrases, the reality was brutally simple. Because she existed, because she was pure, because her womb was empty, waiting to be filled with the seed of empire. From that moment, the transformation began. Her bright gowns and French colors were taken away, replaced with heavy black silks in the Spanish style, garment of wealth that whispered of mourning. Tutors drilled her in Spanish phrases, foreign words that felt like stones in her mouth. Court officials measured her body with clinical detachment. Every inch assessed for childbearing potential. Her spontaneous laughter, her games, her books of romance tales, all stripped from her like childhood itself. But the cruelest ritual awaited. In a chamber heavy with candle smoke, strange men with cold hands examined her body in a public verification of virginity. Not for her well-being. No, it was theater, performed before clerks, ambassadors, physicians, all of them strangers, all of them witnesses to her body reduced to parchment and seal. She left that room not only in tears, but with a new and terrible understanding that she no longer belonged to herself. Soon after came the journey south, a funeral march of innocence across France. Villagers cheered her procession, waving flowers and praising the peace her sacrifice had bought. But inside the gilded carriage, Isabelle sat hollow-eyed, memorizing the clouds above, the voices of her countrymen, the smell of French earth. She knew each passing mile carried her further from home, further from the girl she once was. At the border, by the river Bidassoa, the ritual of erasure was complete. They called it the exchange of princesses. On one bank, her French attendants, women who had known her since infancy, said their last goodbyes. On the other, strangers waited to clothe her in Spain. Every connection to her homeland was stripped away. Her gowns, her jewels, even the locket her mother had given her, even the cross blessed at her baptism. Naked of identity, she crossed the bridge. Each step over the water carried another piece of her childhood downstream. And waiting on the other side, in the dark corridors of Madrid, was Philip II, the man who would become her husband, her master, and in the eyes of history, her executioner by slow despair, a child in a gilded cage. Before she became a queen in chains, Isabelle de Valois had been a child of light. The Valois court in France was nothing like the austere world that awaited her in Spain. The Louvre, where she grew up, was less fortress and more palace of dreams, a place where Renaissance ideals bloomed in stone and glass. Courtiers paraded in silks dyed in every shade of the rainbow. Poets recited verses to the rhythm of lutes, and painters filled halls with images of saints, heroes, and myths. To a child's eyes, it must have seemed like a kingdom of endless wonder. Isabelle, the daughter of King Henry II and Catherine Medici, thrived in this world. She was lively, curious, playful. She adored dolls dressed in miniature gowns, delighted in embroidery lessons where she stitched tiny flowers in the cloth, and dance and music that echoed to the palace chambers. Her laughter was a familiar melody to her siblings, especially to her sisters, with whom she played endless games of hide and seek among the mazes of royal gardens. And yet, as she grew, the shadow of her future quietly lengthened. Her tutors praised her for intelligence and grace, but in their notes to her parents, they also recorded something else: her health, her body, her potential. Even in childhood, she was being measured against the future demands of politics. France at the time was weary. The Italian wars, spanning over half a century, had drained the treasury and scattered bones across Europe. Cities were ruined, villages burned, harvests lost. Her father, Henry II, like his predecessors, had pursued glory in Italy but returned only with debts and bloody flags. Spain, under Charles V and then Philip II, had been the other half of this endless feud. Two great Catholic powers locked in a struggle neither could truly win. By the late 1550s, exhaustion overcame ambition. Both kingdoms sought peace, and so the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis was drafted. On parchment, it ended decades of conflict. In reality, it demanded flesh to seal its words. Royal flesh. Dynastic marriages were not new. Europe had long treated daughters as bargaining chips. But in Isabelle's case, the transaction was almost grotesque in its cruelty. She was chosen not because of her character or her desires, but because of her birth and her womb. She was young, pure, untouched, perfect for Philip II, the widowed king of Spain, who demanded an alliance not in words but in bloodlines. Imagine being 13 and hearing this decree. Isabelle's world was still one of dolls and songbooks, of embroidery needles and whispered secrets shared with her sisters. She did not yet think of herself as a woman, and yet, one day, adults with grave faces entered her chamber and told her she would soon be Queen of Spain. She must have stared at them in disbelief. Marriage to her was a concept from fairy tales. Queens belonged in stories, not in her life. But there was no escaping reality. When she asked why her, the answer was both obvious and unspoken. Because she was a daughter, because she was fertile, because she was disposable in the service of France. Her mother, Catherine de' Medici, was said to have comforted her with words of duty, telling her she was chosen by God and by history. But Catherine herself had once been a pawn in marriage politics, sent from Florence to France at just 14. If she felt sympathy, she disguised it beneath the mask of necessity. Kings and queens were not parents first. They were rulers, and their children were instruments of their rule. The preparations began swiftly. Isabelle's bright gowns and French colors were set aside. She was dressed instead in black and gold, the colors of Spain, colors heavy with gravity and mourning. She was instructed in Spanish phrases, drilled to abandon her French tongue in public. Her playthings disappeared one by one. In their place came rosaries, prayer books, and lectures on duty. But the most humiliating moment was still to come. Before her journey, she was subjected to a ritual that would haunt her memory, the public verification of her virginity. Surrounded by physicians, clerks, and strangers, she was examined like livestock. There was no privacy, no dignity, only the cold hands of men who did not see a child, but a vessel to be traded. When they declared her untouched, the announcement was met not with compassion, but with satisfaction. She was fit for the King of Spain. Isabelle returned to her chambers in tears. Whatever remained of her childhood slipped away that night. For the first time, she understood in her bones what her father's treaty meant. She was no longer Isabelle, daughter of France. She was property. Still, the machinery of politics turned without pause. The treaty was signed. The dowry was agreed upon. The marriage was announced across Europe. And Isabelle, little more than a girl, prepared to leave her home forever. The court celebrated. France breathed relief at the end of war. But for one child, the bells of peace tolled like a funeral dirge. The price of peace, a child's body. When a war ends, history books often tally its costs in numbers. Dead soldiers, emptied treasuries, lost fortresses. But the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis was written not only in ink and wax, but also in the body of a child. Isabelle de Valois would pay for Europe's peace not with blood spilled on a battlefield, but with the surrender of her youth, her freedom, and her very self. Her father, Henry II, explained it as best he could. France had been bled dry by decades of war. Fields were barren, peasants starved, soldiers deserted. Spain was too powerful to defeat, and peace could only be secured through an alliance. To seal it, a marriage was necessary, and the bride had to come from his own family. Out of all his daughters, Isabelle was chosen. She was the right age, the right level of innocence, the most unspoiled jewel in the Valois crown. To the men gathered around negotiation tables, she was the ideal solution. To Isabelle herself, she was simply the unlucky one. Her protests, if she ever dared voice them, would have been brushed aside. Your sacrifice will save thousands, she was told. You will bring peace to France. You will be honored as a queen. But these words, noble on the surface, could not mask the cruelty of the reality, that her body was not her own. The Spanish court demanded proof of what they were purchasing. And so, in one of the most humiliating rituals of royal marriage diplomacy, Isabelle's virginity had to be certified. Picture the scene. A room heavy with incense, designed to suggest dignity, but incapable of disguising its barbarity. Doctors, clerics, and officials stood watch as a child was led in. Her veil was lifted, her gown loosened. The cold hands of strangers touched her body, examined what should have been sacred. They were not healers, not caretakers. They were inspectors, treating her like a parcel to be checked before shipment. The verdict was delivered with clinical detachment. She was untouched, fit for Philip II, fit for the role of broodmare to an empire. The men nodded, satisfied. The treaty's human seal was validated. But for Isabelle, the damage was invisible and permanent. She left that chamber trembling, ashamed, and confused. Until that day, her body had been her own, innocent, unthinking, unburdened. Afterward, she understood with terrifying clarity. She belonged to others now, to Spain, to the treaty, to history itself. Even Catherine de' Medici, her mother, could not shield her. Catherine, hardened by her own experiences as a Florentine pawn sent into France's court at 14, tried to steal her daughter with talk of duty. "This is your destiny," she might have said. But behind her words was resignation, not comfort. Catherine knew too well what it meant to be consumed by the machinery of power. From that moment forward, Isabelle's preparation became a ritual of erasure. Every trace of France was stripped away. Her bright gowns were packed up, in their place. Tailors draped her in black silk. Spain's somber uniform, designed to bury her beneath solemnity. Her jewelry, too, was changed. Gold chains heavy with religious symbols replaced the lighter trinkets of her girlhood. Her language was targeted as well. Courtiers instructed her to abandon her native French and speak Spanish in public. When she stumbled, they corrected her sharply. Each mispronounced word was a reminder that her own voice no longer belonged to her. She was reminded daily of what awaited her in Spain. Philip II was not a fairy tale prince, but a widowed king, stern, pious, and twice her age. He had already buried 3 wives. Now he expected her to provide what the others had not, a male heir to secure his empire. And still, despite the weight pressing down on her, Isabelle clung to small pieces of childhood. At night, she whispered prayers in French, even when she was told not to. She tucked a small doll under her pillow, her last companion from innocence. She traced the embroidery she herself had stitched into its gown, as though touching proof that she had once been free. But the doll could not protect her, nor could the prayers. For soon, the day came when she was told to leave France forever. The court celebrated with feasts and processions. To the nobility, Isabelle was a symbol of triumph, proof that peace had been won. But to the girl at the center of it all, every trumpet and bell sounded like another nail in the coffin of her freedom. The French public cheered, calling her La Bienheureuse, the blessed one, who would bring peace between 2 great nations. She smiled because she had to, her face a mask rehearsed in mirrors. But inside she felt none of their joy. She was not blessed. She was condemned. The journey south was long, ceremonial, and heavy with ritual. Isabelle's carriage moved like a funeral procession through towns and villages. Crowds lined the roads, tossing flowers, shouting blessings, praising her sacrifice. But she sat inside with her hands folded, silent, staring at the countryside she would never see again. Every passing field, every familiar sound of French voices was like a thread being cut. Ahead lay the border. Ahead lay the ceremony of exchange, the ritual in which her last ties to France would be severed. And beyond that border waited Spain, and Philip II, and a life that would not be her own, crossing the river of no return. The journey ended at the river Bidasoa, a winding line of water that marked the border between France and Spain. It was here that the most theatrical and the most cruel ritual of royal marriage awaited Isabelle de Valois. It was called the Exchange of the Princesses, a tradition as old as dynastic politics itself. It was meant to symbolize the total surrender of one identity in order to assume another. In reality, it was nothing less than a ceremony of erasure. On the French bank stood the companions of her youth, ladies in waiting, governesses, attendants who had guided her from cradle to adolescence. They had brushed her hair in the mornings, shared laughter with her over spilled ink and crooked embroidery, whispered prayers with her at night. They were family in every sense that mattered. On the Spanish bank stood strangers, men and women of a foreign court, dressed in black and gold, their eyes sharp, their voices stern. They did not see a child crossing the river. They saw an asset, a tool, a queen-to-be. The rules of the ritual were unbending. Isabelle was to step out of her French garments and be reclothed in Spanish ones. Every stitch, every jewel, every token from her homeland had to be removed. Even personal keepsakes, a locket from her mother, a small rosary blessed in the Louvre chapel, were forbidden. To Spain, she must arrive as a vessel empty to France. Imagine her in that moment, a girl of 14, standing between 2 banks of a river, stripped of the fabrics and symbols that tied her to her past. She watched as her French attendants wept, forbidden to cross. She turned to them one last time, committing their faces to memory, knowing she would never see them again. Then she faced the Spaniards, who studied her not with affection, but with cold assessment. Her hands trembled as she removed her gown. The silks of France, embroidered with lilies of the Valois, slid from her shoulders. She stood exposed, shivering not from cold, but from the weight of what was happening. Then the Spanish women approached, draping her in black silk heavy with gold thread. The fabric felt less like clothing than chains. When the ritual was complete, she looked into a polished silver mirror. The reflection staring back at her was both familiar and foreign. It was Isabelle, but not Isabelle. The colors of France were gone. Her childhood was gone. In their place stood a figure sculpted for Spain, silent, grave, and burdened. The river crossing was swift, but it was irreversible. Step by step, she walked across the bridge as trumpets sounded and banners waved. The French delegation bowed their heads in sorrow. The Spanish delegation bowed in triumph. When she reached the far side, the bridge behind her seemed to vanish into mist. She had entered Spain. She would never go home again. From that moment, her life was choreographed by strangers. She was instructed on how to walk, how to bow, how to speak to Philip II. Every gesture was corrected. Every slip of French was frowned upon. The Spaniards called her our queen, but they treated her not as a person, but as a prize newly won. For Isabelle, the world suddenly felt smaller. The laughter of her sisters, the gardens of the Louvre, the music of the French court, all of it belonged to another life, one that now felt like a dream fading upon waking. Ahead of her loomed Spain, vast, suspicious, devout, and suffocating. And somewhere beyond Madrid's walls waited Philip II, a man she knew only by reputation. He was said to be solemn, pious, consumed by duty, and colder than winter stone. She had heard whispers of how he treated his wives, how he measured them not in affection but in heirs. Isabelle's heart must have pounded with dread. She was crossing not just a river, but a threshold into a prison from which there would be no return. The exchange of princesses was complete. France had lost a daughter. Spain had gained a queen. And Isabelle de Valois, once a laughing child, had become a shadow draped in silks of mourning. Madrid, a palace of shadows. The road into Spain was nothing like the roads she had known in France. The French countryside had been soft. Rolling hills, vineyards, villages with painted shutters, and laughter spilling from taverns. Spain, by contrast, greeted Isabelle with a harsher face. Dry plains stretched beneath a pitiless sun. The air was heavy with dust. Villages were sparse, their people watchful and silent. Where France had smiled, Spain seemed to scrutinize. The procession moved slowly toward Madrid, the new capital of Philip II's empire. Carriages creaked under the weight of trunks filled with Spanish silks and jewels. Soldiers rode in solemn formation, their armor glinting like shards of ice in the light. At every stop, peasants gathered to glimpse their new queen. They did not cheer as loudly as the French had. Instead, they stared, curious, suspicious, some whispering prayers under their breath. It was not hostility. It was something colder. To them, Isabelle was not a girl, but a vessel. They had no interest in her laughter or her tears. What mattered was her womb, and what heirs it might deliver to Spain. As the procession reached Madrid, the city itself loomed before her. This was no Paris, no Florence, no Rome. Madrid was smaller then, austere and gray, more fortress than jewel. Its narrow streets twisted like mazes. Its buildings rose stern and unadorned. The scent of incense and candle smoke clung to the air. Where the French court had dazzled with color and song, the Spanish capital carried the weight of silence. And at its heart stood the Alcázar, the royal palace. A dark, brooding structure of stone it did not welcome. It loomed. Towers pierced the sky like warning fingers. Its halls, lined with heavy tapestries and dimly lit by flickering torches, seemed less a home than a monastery or a prison. Here, Isabelle was led through corridors that swallowed sound. The courtiers bowed as she passed, but their eyes were sharp, calculating. She could feel their judgments in every glance. Was she devout enough? Obedient enough? Fertile enough? In Spain's court, she was not a child, nor even truly a woman. She was a vessel to be tested. At last, she was presented to Philip II. He was nothing like the kings of fairy tales. There was no warmth in him, no trace of affection, pale from years spent in study and prayer. With a beard streaked by age and eyes that seemed always cast downward, he looked less like a monarch than a confessor. He spoke softly, but without intimacy. His words were measured, precise, delivered as though he were reciting scripture. He did not smile at her. He did not take her hand with tenderness. He studied her, as one might study a relic or a piece of land newly acquired. Philip was 32, old enough to be her father. He had already buried 3 wives. He had no need of a partner, no desire for companionship. What he required was simple: a young body capable of producing sons. Isabelle, standing before him in her heavy Spanish gown, must have felt the weight of her own smallness. She was a child dressed as a queen, facing a man who seemed carved from stone. The courtiers murmured approval. France and Spain were bound. The treaty was alive. Peace had been purchased with this union. But Isabelle did not feel like a queen. She felt like a shadow, absorbed into a world that was not her own, her voice drowned beneath layers of silken silence. In the days that followed, preparations for the wedding began. The city bustled with activity. Tailors sewing gowns, priests drafting ceremonies, musicians rehearsing solemn hymns. The people of Madrid prepared for a spectacle. But for Isabelle, each preparation was a chain tightened around her. She had crossed a river of no return. She had entered a palace of shadows. And now she would be bound, body and soul, to a man who saw her not as a partner, but as a duty. The wedding night, blood and chains. The day of the wedding dawned with all the weight of empire. Madrid stirred early, its streets crowded with nobles, courtiers, and priests. Trumpets rang out across the city. Church bells pealed in long, solemn waves, their echoes rolling over the rooftops. Inside the cathedral, the air was thick with incense. Tapestries hung from the walls, their golden threads catching the candlelight, while choirs filled the vaulted space with hymns meant to disguise the human tragedy at its center. At the altar stood Philip II, dressed in black velvet embroidered with silver thread. He looked less like a groom than a judge awaiting testimony. His face was unreadable, his hands folded in patience. Then came Isabelle, 14 years old, draped in a gown of gold and silver, its train carried by attendants. The fabric shimmered under the candles, dazzling the eyes of spectators. To the nobles, she was radiant. To the diplomats, she was victory. But if one looked closely, if one dared look beyond the glittering facade, they would have seen her trembling hands, her pale lips pressed into a line of dread. The ceremony was magnificent, scripted to perfection. Bishops intoned Latin prayers that rose into the arches. Rings were exchanged, blessings given. The people saw only grandeur. None saw the child shrinking beneath the weight of vows she scarcely understood. When the words were spoken and the union sealed, the cathedral erupted in celebration. Trumpets blared, bells clanged, courtiers applauded. Spain had its queen. France had its peace. The treaty was alive, breathing through the body of a girl. But the true ritual still awaited: the consummation of the marriage. That evening, in chambers heavy with silks and candles, Isabelle was led to the marriage bed. The room was crowded not only with attendants, but also with expectation. For in royal unions, intimacy was not private. It was a matter of politics. The bedding was ceremonial, the consummation of public proof. Sheets would be inspected. Witnesses waited beyond the door. Isabelle lay on the bed, her body tense with fear. Philip approached, methodical, clinical, a man performing duty rather than desire. There were no words of comfort, no gestures of tenderness. For him, this was a transaction, a necessary act to seal the alliance. For her, it was the end of childhood. When it was done, when the blood of her virginity stained the sheets, attendants collected them with satisfaction. The proof was carried outside, displayed before courtiers as though it were a relic. Applause followed, blessings were whispered. Spain rejoiced, but Isabelle did not rejoice. She curled into herself, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The world outside the chamber heard only celebration. Inside, a child's heart broke. From that night onward, Isabelle understood her place. Her body was no longer her own. It belonged to Spain, to Philip, to the future heirs expected of her. She was not a wife. She was not even fully a woman. She was a vessel. The golden gown, the glittering jewels, the hymns and blessings, all of it had been amassed to conceal the reality that a girl had been bound in blood and chains. The machinery of childbearing. From the moment the sheets of her wedding night were displayed, Isabelle ceased to be seen as a girl, or even as a queen in the full sense of the word. She became something narrower, something mechanical, a vessel for heirs. The Spanish court made no attempt to hide this truth. Every glance from the grandees, every murmur among the courtiers, every blessing whispered by priests circled back to a single expectation. Sons. Not daughters, not mere children, but male heirs who would secure the dynasty of the most Catholic king. For a 14-year-old whose body was still half-child, the pressure was suffocating. Each month, her cycle was watched. Her appetite, her complexion, her faintness, her vitality were all noted by the ladies of the bedchamber, who in turn reported to physicians, confessors, and finally to Philip himself. There was no privacy. Her body was a ledger, and every change was recorded. When she missed a bleeding, whispers spread. When she vomited at table, speculation soared. And when she miscarried, when the blood came too soon, when the tiny hope of a life slipped silently away, the disappointment of a kingdom fell upon her shoulders. Miscarriage was not treated as tragedy, but as failure. Attendants prayed more fervently. Physicians prescribed harsher regimens. Confessors urged deeper piety. Some whispered that God was punishing France through her. Others muttered that she was too frail, too young, unfit for the burden of empire. Yet each time she was sent back into the cycle. The physicians ordered her to walk less, to eat differently, to swallow bitter tonics. Midwives and matrons fussed endlessly over her womb as if it were a battlefield. Even in prayer, she was reminded, "Your duty is to give Spain a son." Philip himself was distant, coldly dutiful. He did not scold her, nor did he comfort her. He simply observed, recorded, and waited. To him, her miscarriages were not the loss of children. They were delays in succession. And Isabelle, each time she lost a child, a little piece of her heart crumbled. Alone in her chambers, she wept silently, for she had no mother's arms, no sister's embrace, no one to tell her that she was still only a girl. Instead, she was told to pray harder, to endure, to try again. The machinery of childbearing turned relentlessly. She was little more than a gear within it, ground down with each passing year. The court measured her value not by her laughter, not by her kindness, not even by her queenship, but by the state of her womb. And though she still painted her lips with smiles for ceremonies, though she still walked in procession as though adorned with glory, inside she grew hollow. Spain had not married Isabelle de Valois. Spain had married her fertility. Whispers in the dark. The Alcázar was a palace of stone, but to Isabelle it felt like a cloistered tomb. Its corridors echoed not with laughter, but with footsteps muffled by carpets. The courtiers moved like shadows, whispering behind fans, their eyes always fixed upon her. In France, she had once run through gardens, her skirts gathering dew. In Madrid, she was told to move slowly, to bow often, to lower her gaze. Every hour of her day was structured. Mass, meals, embroidery, processions, audiences. Even her prayers were timed. Freedom was a word that had no meaning here. But what weighed heaviest was not the routine. It was the whispers. Every miscarriage, every fainting spell, every sigh too heavy for her age became fuel for gossip. Was she pious enough? Did she truly confess her sins? Or did French vanity corrupt her prayers? Some muttered that her French blood cursed her womb, that God himself withheld heirs from Spain to punish the alliance. The whispers slipped beneath doors, coiled around her bed, haunted her even in sleep. Philip did not shield her. He heard them, perhaps even encouraged them with his silence. He did not rage at her, nor did he comfort her. He simply watched, always with that same cool detachment, as though he were weighing her on invisible scales. To Isabelle, he was not a husband. He was a confessor, a judge, and a jailer. His presence filled rooms with chill, even when he touched her hand in public. It was ceremonial, an act for the court, not for her heart. And yet, She longed for warmth. Sometimes she laughed too brightly in the company of her French attendants, the few who had been allowed to remain. Sometimes she lingered in the gardens longer than was proper, delighting in flowers that reminded her of home. Sometimes she smiled too freely at courtiers who treated her kindly. The Spanish court noticed. It always noticed. Her moments of joy became subjects of suspicion. A smile too wide, a laugh too loud. Perhaps it was flirtation. Perhaps the French queen was not chaste in spirit. Even her confessor pressed her. Was her heart pure? Did she harbor sinful affection for men not her husband? Isabelle's world tightened into a cage of glances and murmurs. She was never alone, and yet she had never been more lonely. In the dark of her chambers, she sometimes pressed her face into her pillows and whispered prayers not for heirs, not for Spain, not even for herself, but for escape. Escape from the court, from the whispers, from the shadow of the man who was both her king and her jailer. But there was no escape, only silence and shadows and the endless expectation of heirs that never came. The brief glow of hope. For years, Isabelle's days have been marked by silence, suspicion, and the suffocating machinery of childbearing. But even in the coldest courts, even in the sternest palaces, moments of warmth can flicker through. At last, her womb carried life a term. When she felt the first movements inside her, when her hand brushed against her swelling belly, something long dormant within her stirred. For the first time since leaving France, she allowed herself to feel joy. Not the forced, ceremonial smile she wore at processions, but real joy. She was young still, only in her mid-teens, and in those quiet moments, she let herself imagine not politics, not treaties, but motherhood. The court, too, shifted. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was hope. Midwives hovered. Physicians gave cautious praise. Courtiers spoke more gently. Even Philip himself seemed to thaw, if only slightly. He visited her chambers more often, speaking not of her health, but of the child within her. Not of her, but of the future. It was not love. It was not tenderness. But it was attention, and that, in the bleak desert of her marriage, felt like rain. And then the child was born. The bells of Madrid rang out, their sound rolling across the hills. Cannons thundered. Spain rejoiced. The queen had given life. It was a girl. Yet even so, the court celebrated, for where there was one child, there might be more. Isabelle held the baby in her arms, her tiny fingers curling around her own. For a moment, all the whispers, all the pressures, all the cold eyes melted away. She was not a queen. She was not a vessel. She was a mother. She whispered lullabies in French, the only place she dared still use her childhood tongue. In those nights, she rediscovered laughter. She smiled more easily. She allowed herself to believe, if only briefly, that her life might not be only chains and shadows. But happiness in the Spanish court was never permitted to last. The child grew sickly, as so many royal infants did in that age. The palace physicians came and went, their remedies more ritual than cure. Isabelle prayed, fasted, wept. She begged God to spare her baby, to let her keep at least this one joy. But heaven was silent. The child slipped away. The bells tolled again, but this time in mourning. The court's whispers returned sharper than ever. Isabelle had birthed a child, yes, but not a son, and not one who lived. To many, it was no victory at all. To some, it was proof of her unfitness, her failure. Isabelle, once glowed with the fragile happiness of motherhood, now sank into grief. She had touched joy, only to have it ripped from her arms. And in that cruel contrast, her heart grew heavier than before. The glow of hope had been real, but it was brief, too brief, and its fading left her in deeper shadow than ever. A queen in mourning. The palace had rejoiced for a heartbeat, and then it had turned its back. Isabelle, once radiant with the fragile light of motherhood, now moved like a ghost through the Alcázar. Her laughter was gone. Her voice, once soft with shy sweetness, now broke often into silence. She dressed in darker gowns, heavy silks that weighed her down, as though the garments themselves were grieving. Madrid pitied her, but only in whispers. In public, the court did not pause. The kingdom still required heirs. The bishops still preached about duty. The courtiers still measured her worth by her womb. And Philip? He acknowledged her sorrow with the same detachment with which he acknowledged everything. He permitted masses to be said. He allowed her to rest, but only briefly. He reminded her gently, always gently, that she must not despair. For despair was sin, and sin was weakness, and weakness threatened the stability of Spain. To Isabelle, those words were daggers hidden in Scripture. What comfort was there in being told her grief was sin? What solace in hearing that her tears endangered a kingdom? Her health began to decline. She grew pale, fragile, as if each breath cost her something. The physicians prescribed endless remedies, herbs, broths, bleeding. Nothing helped. Her body was exhausted, worn down by miscarriages, by pregnancies too close together, by grief too heavy for her age. Yet the machinery did not stop. She was pressed to try again, to conceive again, to carry again. Every failure, every loss, deepened her isolation. Sometimes, late at night, she sat alone by candlelight, staring at the small rosary she had once carried from France. It had been nearly taken from her at the border, but she had kept it hidden, a relic of the girl she once was. She whispered prayers not for Spain, not for Philip, but for her mother, for her sisters, for the home she would never see again. And in those whispers, a longing grew, a longing not for life, but for release. Isabelle was still only in her late teens. By the measure of youth, she should have been laughing, dancing, dreaming of futures not yet written. Instead, she was fading. Slowly, inevitably, she was being consumed by the very role she had been forced into. The court did not see her as dying. It saw her as failing. And in the end, the difference did not matter.